Okay, thanks everyone. So I pitched this title of a talk to Sunny, and I said, okay, does Braided River Management have a carbon footprint? But yeah, when I looked at the talk now, or that title, it's a bit less clear what I actually think I'm going to be talking about. So to start with, what I'm not going to be talking about, maybe. When I talk about a braided rivers, a river footprint, I'm not talking about the kind of carbon footprint of us driving out there to do some research, which is, I think, so, what is a carbon footprint? That's the term we most often hear this term in regards to, like, your personal life choices. Are you flying in an airplane? Are you driving a car? How much CO2 emissions might be coming out of that vehicle? Which I'm sure my research does have a decent carbon footprint of us driving around, but it's not really interesting enough for me to spend 20 minutes talking about. Someone could probably work out that math pretty quickly. Instead, what I'm going to be talking to you about is how the river itself has a carbon balance. And as we talk about all these different things that are stressing our rivers and all of the different things we'd like to do to improve the management and the health of our rivers, these could be, should be, and probably are affecting how carbon is actually stored or emitted from the river itself. So kind of a different lens for bringing together all of these different kind of concerns we have about braided river health. So, whether we're talking about nesting habits of birds and whether they're disappearing from lowland stretches of river, if we're talking about huge invasive weeds like willows or maybe macrophytes, we're talking about controlling mammals, mammalian pests on the river. That change in biotic community often is done by different people in different places that are experts on one thing or the next, and probably done by different people than those that are focusing on the other kind of aspect of stress on braided rivers, right? Like, are we extracting water from it? Are the rivers being straightened? Are there channels diminishing in number? Are they becoming less complex? Or, which actually I don't think, it's usually hard to get away from talking about kind of nutrient pollution in Canterbury water forums, but I'll just mention it briefly here, that this is one of the other stresses that our rivers are under. And all of those are really complex issues that we like to think about individually, but the river experiences them all at the same time, regardless of what we might like to think about, right? So what I'm pitching here is kind of thinking about the kind of carbon budget or carbon footprint of the river. It's really a way of bringing together and connecting all of these different stressors. And this is kind of a lens we can use to try to kind of weigh up what the net effect of all of these different aspects are. So through this talk, I'll be talking about some work we've been doing, trying to figure out kind of the balance of things like carbon and nitrogen and how those are affected by this huge range of stressors in rivers. But I also want to point out, before I get too far into that what I'm not going to be talking about is, like our solution to fixing climate change. So here's a graph from the IPCC of CO2 emissions from humans. This kind of dark blue one is from fossil fuels. And for reference, around the world, rivers naturally, let's say, emit about 2 gigatons of CO2 per year. So that's equivalent of somewhere less than 10% of annual fossil fuel emissions. So I put that up there to kind of put it in context of, rivers carry carbon through them. They emit some to the atmosphere, and it is a large quantity. So it's worth trying to figure out if what we're doing is exacerbating that problem or not. But yeah, we shouldn't take this to be, your kind of, we shouldn't cover all our rivers with cement to try to save the climate, is what I'm saying. Okay, so what is the carbon balance or carbon footprint or carbon budget of a river? So in a braided river, like any other river, we have carbon coming into it from the land, generally speaking, around it. Carbon moves downstream, like everything in a river. But because Some of it will also get turned into a gas, which is CO2, and that gets emitted back into the atmosphere. And rivers are full of living things. Those living things are respiring the CO2 into the atmosphere, but some of them are also photosynthesizing, and that means they're taking up CO2 into them. So rivers are really, if you think of them as a complete organism, they're breathing in and out CO2, just like us, just a little bit bigger. And nitrogen is also part of this story. Nitrogen will come from the land. I could have drawn another arrow there. Moves through the river. And some of that will also be transformed by all of the little organisms living in the river into the gas nitrous oxide. So that's part of this story. It's also a greenhouse gas. So also something we're worried about or you would want to take into account if you want to say, okay, what's the net effect of all of these stresses or all of the kind of, let's say, restoration work on a river. We want to figure out how it's changing that kind of balance of nitrous oxide or carbon dioxide. And there is a reason to think that all of these things that we're worried about with rivers, right, like the amount of nutrient, the flow levels, the light, so kind of how turbid is the water, or is it being shaded by trees, the plants that are living there, will all affect these to a different way, different degree. Okay, so before I get into my actual data, I did want to make sure that I took a moment to thank and acknowledge all of the students that have really made this work happen. There's been an awful lot of them, and they've done a tremendous amount of work. Okay, so going back in time a little bit to kind of tell a story about how I got to this point of saying I wanted to do a talk about carbon footprints in rivers. Back in 2021, I moved back to New Zealand, and I was keen to start some work on braided rivers. They're really impressive, and I was kind of worried about nitrate pollution in Canterbury, as a lot of people are. But I'd been told that, you know, braided rivers are useless, uninteresting to look at something like nitrate in, because braided rivers are very big and they're very cold and the water is moving very quickly. Nothing really happens in them except some birds nest on them. So I decided to test that because I'm a bit contrary. So my student, Mohammed Ar, and I picked 8 different rivers in Canterbury that we wanted to investigate. We wanted 4 of them to be the kind of smaller kind of hill-fed or hill country rivers, and then 4 of them to be the larger alpine-fed rivers, the ones that really are supposed to have nothing happening them because they're too cold, too fast-flowing. And we wanted some with lower nitrate concentrations and some with higher nitrate concentrations. So this graph was made from ECAN's data that goes back 20 years. So again, not exactly sure really where they collected the samples from on the river. And this line here shows the mean annual discharge of the different rivers, just kind of for reference. Great, so Mohammed went out and did a tremendous amount of work collecting samples from all 8 of these rivers in different seasons, measuring how much nitrous oxide there was there, to see if it was actually increasing with the amount of nitrate, which would imply that these rivers are really alive, that there's a lot of microbes in it that are really transforming nitrogen and, you know, active. So yeah, before I actually show the data, just point of reference. So I'm plotting this y-axis as the percent saturation of nitrous oxide. So it'd be kind of like dissolved oxygen, if any of you guys have measured dissolved oxygen, right? So 100% saturation would mean it's in perfect equilibrium with the air. If it's anything above 100% saturated, it means it's emitting the gas to the air. If it's below 100% saturated, it's taking it up. And also note that these are very different y-axis scales, about an order of magnitude different. So this is what Mohammed found. So on the, basically all of the rivers are sources of nitrous oxide, which isn't crazy. It is just a natural thing that happens. But most interestingly, when there's more nitrate, there's more nitrous oxide coming out of the rivers, really to quite a large degree on some of those kind of Selwyn, Waikiri, and Orari. And even in our large alpine rivers, where the flow is extremely high and the nitrate levels are actually quite low in the scheme of things, there does seem to be a response where you have more nitrous oxide being created when there's more nitrate. So we could end the story right there and say, great, if you pollute a river, it will create a climate feedback because there's more nitrous oxide coming out. But as I was, spending all this time walking around rivers, looking for field sites, trying to figure out how we could possibly sample such complicated places, one of the things that I really started to notice was all of these different channels, which is, of course, why we were there in the first place, right? We wanted to look at, were there differences between the large, so I've done a really weak classification of the different channels of a braided river. So the main channel would be the one with the majority of the water. Anything that's narrower we call a side channel. There's a lot of dry river, but I'm not really going to talk about that here. And then we have this kind of catch-all category of a backwater, which is any part of the river that is only connected to the flow in one side or zero sides. So there are all these different channels, but they look really different. And this photo kind of highlights part of why they look really different, right? You see these kind of booms of stuff growing or living in those different channels at different times. So I was talking to Angus, who will maybe talk more about this next, and his student Holly Harris around this time, and they invited me to come up to the Cass River in Tekapo because she was doing some work across these different channels, and they had kind of similar questions. So this was a chance to start exploring how all of these different channels might be affecting kind of how the kind of balance of carbon in a river. And the easiest way to get at the balance of carbon in a river is actually to measure oxygen, because it's a lot cheaper to measure. So you can put in these white things there, which are sensors that just measure oxygen every 10 minutes. We did secure them a little bit better than that, but not good enough. So we put in some of these into the different size channels, and Holly kept them in there for about 5 months. So what I want to show you here is you can see the amount of oxygen in the water every day. It increases and decreases every day. So that's the organisms in the river, but really like the river breathing, right? So it's producing oxygen during the day, and it's producing CO2 at night, basically. So there is a perfect relationship, really, between CO2 and oxygen. You can use that to calculate the amount of growth happening in a river, so the amount of carbon uptake versus the amount of respiration or kind of breakdown of carbon, and figure out a balance. So we kept those loggers in until they were all swept away and buried, so if anyone goes up to Tekapo, let me know if you find them. And then we could try to, or I worked on with the data we did have, kind of scaling that out to that whole study reach. And this finding really struck me. So what we have in this very blurry kind of table is the percent of the surface water of each of those types of channels relative to their contribution to the carbon budget or the breathing of the river. The main thing here is that over 90% of the carbon cycling or processing or balance of the river is driven by those small side channels and springs. The main stem of the river, which is about half of the surface area, and probably a lot more if you were to count up water in terms of volume or discharge, is like 10% of the carbon balance. So these kind of small channels are super important, not just as maybe habitats for kind of large, cute things, but also for how these rivers exist on the planet, and kind of really the base of the food web, which is carbon. So I thought that was a really impressive finding. It was amazing. So my student Lucas last year tried to replicate something pretty similar in the Selwyn Waikiri, because that's a lot more accessible, isn't it? So this was, we put in some oxygen loggers, or he put in some oxygen loggers around Hororata. And again, so we're looking at oxygen levels in the river, in the main channel, and in the side channel, and in a backwater channel. And I think, again, you see that even though there's this kind of diurnal rhythm across the whole river, even though these loggers are only meters apart from each other, there really is a different rhythm in those different channels. So that was cool. But when we added it up to get that kind of net carbon balance for that reach of the river, I would note that we've got about 10 times or twice as much respiration, so going down in the negative numbers, as we saw in the Cass. So it's always good to have a study size of n equals 2. But it started to make, okay, is the reason that we see such a different carbon balance in the Selwyn, because it does have, it's not a real braided river, maybe. It doesn't have that many channels. Or is it because of something else? So I think it's also useful then to start to break this up or back into what the contribution from those different channels was. So the main channel here is a larger proportion of the surface area, because it does have a lot less complexity than the Cass, compared to the size in backwater. And you still have those smaller channels making a disproportionate contribution to kind of carbon cycling, to productivity, but it's a lot less of a disparity to what we're seeing in the Cass River, which, so that kind of starts to bring back question or ideas about what else is happening, what else is different between kind of a relatively nice river up in Mackenzie versus something like the Selwyn River. So that kind of led to the next progression of questions, like, okay, so as the kind of health of a river is perhaps degrading, how is that changing how it breathes or how it cycles carbon and nitrogen? Which I think this beautiful suite of photos I have here highlights some of those things that we all worry about when you go around our lowland braided rivers, right? You start to see a lot more permanent algae. So, I mean, those big pulses of oxygen we're measuring in the Cass are algae just booming up there, right? So this is a natural part of a braided river life cycle. But in some of the, more lowland rivers, just observationally, it was like, okay, we start to see more of these kind of like, almost like ponds, right, that are holding algae in them, it seems like, all year round. And those often are also associated with this kind of very fine sediments, which I think you can see in these two pictures here, which is also something that will change all of the organisms and microbes that live in the river and maybe would flow through to this kind of carbon budget idea. So to start to test this idea of whether there's maybe a co-importance or what the relative importance of kind of water quality on the one hand and channel complexity on the other hand is into how a braided river functions. We took two rivers as a comparison, the Ashley-Rakahuri and the Orari, because they've got very different nitrate levels but are kind of similar in terms of their size and they're not too scary to work in. We put in loggers and did a lot of measurements in those kind of three channel types, so in a main channel, a side channel, and a backwater. And measured things like oxygen and also directly measured like CO2 and nitrous oxide in them as well. So here's the variations in oxygen, kind of ending winter, going into spring in those two rivers. And with this graph, I think there's two things that kind of stand out that I want to highlight. The first is this massive increase in the kind of amplitude of oxygen cycling in the Orari towards mid-September, which is in exactly this bright green spot. So I think, highlighting, when you have, at that time of year, the temperatures are starting to increase, the daylight is starting to increase, and when you have a bit of water that has extremely high levels of nutrients in it, it really is primed to just explode as soon as the conditions get right, because none of the other channels in either of the rivers responded quite that extremely. And the second thing is this kind of flatlining that happens in the Ashley-Rakahuri after, unfortunately, we took the loggers out of the Orari. And that was quite a large flood that came through, I think, 200 cubic maybe, that really, well, luckily it didn't wash my loggers away, so we have that great data. But you can see it completely stopped river functioning, right? So when the flow was really high, the kind of stuff living in the river wasn't able to take in oxygen or respire oxygen, but it does seem to be recovering within just a few days. So these high flow events are also presumably a really important part of kind of resetting and balancing the river. I think I'm running out of time, so I'll just like really quickly get through this. I've got like 2 slides. Okay, okay. So to answer this question about, so does declining water quality change the carbon balance of braided rivers? So Now we're moving into just collating all of that kind of CO2 coming out of the rivers. So how much are these rivers respiring, comparing between the Ashley and the Orari, and looking at the contribution of these different channels. So in the Ashley, again, we see that the small side channels and the backwater, even though they're a very small proportion of the surface area, are really driving carbon balance. We put up the Orari. Similarly, the side channels are very important. That backwater that was so verdant and green is not really contributing anything at all to the net balance because it's growing so much, so it's kind of taking up a lot of CO2. But that's more than offset by what happens in the side channels as whatever carbon is produced in those backwaters is gassed off, right? So we've got about 20% more CO2 coming out of the Orari than the Ashley Ruckahuri. And that kind of brings back to what I talked about initially, and what was kind of the motivation for this study was the kind of five-fold difference in the amount of nitrogen between these two systems. So the final piece of data I wanted to show was that, I had started with looking at nitrate and thinking about nitrous oxide coming out of it. But actually, there was almost no difference at all between nitrous oxide between these two rivers, which was a real surprise. But mostly is driven by the fact that the Ashley, at the time we were measuring it, was much faster flowing. So even though the concentrations in the water were less, physically it was moving into the atmosphere very efficiently. So anyways, more things to think about if you're really excited about gases in water. But I hope there's obviously a lot more work to be done and more things to think about with this, but I hope that, what you can take from this is that if we're worried about conserving rivers, or as we work on conserving rivers in all of these different aspects, we want to think about both the kind of channels that are there and that kind of physical conservation, as well as other aspects of kind of biology or nutrients or whatever. They are all interacting. And thinking about things like carbon balance of a river can be a really useful way to bring together all of those, really complex things that we worry about on rivers. Great. Thank you very much.